Sweeney Talks To. This is episode 1, and today I'm joined by Rob Arnol. Now, he is a member of the most incarcerated population in the world. You may not know what we're talking about. You may be surprised to find out that that population live in Australia. They are the Aboriginal or the indigenous population over there. Life is not quite as simple for them as it is for people in many other countries. So we want to get Rob on today to talk about it, to explain it to us, and to sort of delve deeper. So first of all, thank you for joining me today, Rob.
You're welcome, Chris.
So you are from the Palawa tribe, which is based in Tasmania. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. The Palawa group of people, Palawa Nation, covers all the particular nations of Tasmania. We were the group that the term genocide was actually invented for. There was an actual war or declaration of war tabled in the British Parliament in the early 1800s against the Aboriginal people of Tasmania. Now, we had no way of reading the declarations that were pinned up in the trees around Tasmania, so we just didn't realise until we started shooting at us. And basically, we were outgunned. They had modern firearms for those days, and we were still with spears and so on. So within a period of around about 70 years, all of the tribal people in Tasmania were literally wiped out to a person. The last had May 4th, 1876, who was trucking in it. 100 years later, we got her remains back from the museum where they've been placed on display and cremated them and scattered them in the Doncaster Channel where she was born, very close to where she was born.
Yeah, because that's someone from your own tribe, your own people who their skeleton was displayed in a museum, and I think people should maybe sort of let that sink in. We're talking about Australia, a first world country, a rich country, developed country, and they were displaying the skeletons of your people almost like a tourist attraction of sorts.
Well, went beyond that too. One of the men from down here, a guy by the name of Sweeney, had his head actually cut off and pickled in a jar of rum, and that was sent to the London College of Surgeons. That remained there until I think it was 1987 or 88 when we finally received that back. So yeah, it makes you wonder about people's ideas of medical research.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you were born in the 1960s. I won't go into your age. I'll spare your blushes. Not that you actually look younger than you are, but we'll not spare your blushes. I'll spare your privacy, shall I say? But racism is something that you've experienced in your own life. I mean, we can maybe go back to the history, but even for yourself, living in 2022, you could remember suffering racism. Your father, the people around you. It's not something that you have to read about. You can remember it.
No, it's something we experience daily down here. Even as little as only a couple of days ago with Invasion Day, or Australia Day, as the general community call it down here. There were discussions at work the day before, and some of the comments were, to be honest, quite hurtful and very racist. Of course, I had my say, and surprised a lot of them because I've only been there a couple of weeks, so a lot of them didn't realise. And there's some very sheepish looks around the morning tea table. So yeah, it happens, and it's happened for years now. My father wasn't allowed to drink in a pub when I was only a kid. They used to have to pass the beer out the window to him. He wasn't allowed inside the doors. If you wanted to drink, it had to be passed out through the window. Those sorts of things have changed, but change is slowly happening, but it's still very, very slow.
And could you maybe tell us about, the boundary streets? For people maybe that are not familiar, this is a kind of I wasn't aware of it till I spoke to you a couple of days ago, but, when in preparation for this, the boundary streets are something that is in a lot of Australian towns, but the reason for them is maybe it's a very disgusting reason, to be honest, that they exist.
Boundary streets exist mainly in the northern Australian towns around Queensland. That is very, very common. And Boundary Street was usually a square that went around the centre of the town, out 3 or 4 blocks, and encompassed all the major businesses and quite a bit of the upper-class living areas. And they were bordered by boundary streets on sort of all 4 sides. And Boundary Street meant after 4 p.m. of an afternoon, an Aboriginal person had to be back over on the correct side of Boundary Street, so away from the white areas, or else they were immediately arrested and thrown in jail until such time as they can be brought up before the courts, which there was never any rush for. So basically, they were also referred to as sundowners house. As the sun was going down, blackfellas had to leave.
And I mean, when you go to these places, or people like you, from Aboriginal sort of backgrounds, when they go to these towns and they go down these streets, it must be almost. I mean, you must feel disturbed. The memories of your forefathers and not being able to be there after 4 o'clock. I mean, it's unbelievable.
It's not a very good feeling. It's one that really it does fill me with a bit of anger, but that's about it. I mean, what it really should do is fill the rest of Australia with shame that this episode actually happened, that they treated one section of the community and the part of the community that literally owns the sovereignty of this land to such an ordeal, to say, no, you can't even walk in your own land past a certain point. I mean, it's more than just colonisation, that's subjugation, really.
And in terms of yourself, sort of growing up, maybe going to school or college, I mean, would people maybe throw out slurs? Would people make assumptions on your personality based on the way you looked and your ethnic background?
Oh yes, at school I was reasonably good at school studies, so I won a few awards, and the first one I ever won was in year 2 or something, and it was mentioned at my grandfather's work, and they said, "Oh, well, it wouldn't be one of your grandsons, Bill, because being black, they haven't got any brains at all." And he took great pleasure the following day and going back saying, "Yes, well, actually, it was my grandson." And various words were said at the time, and I think it degenerated into a bit of a fist fight. Generalisations get made all the time, and you often hear things like, especially for the women, "Oh, you're so pretty for an Aboriginal," and what does that actually mean? Aboriginal women aren't allowed to be pretty, and the men are, geez, we wasn't expecting you to be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. Why not? We can think too. We have quite a few doctors and lawyers now in the Aboriginal community. We have archaeologists, we have people in every range of professions and stuff, but still the general community refuse to recognise it.
And in terms of, today, even today, I'm sure maybe the racism is a lot more subtle as it is in, most parts of the world. And I think we're all a bit more aware of things, but that systematic thing is still there. I mean, I mentioned there that you're the most incarcerated population in the world, which is pretty, it's pretty hard to take in when you lay it out like that,
It's not really that subtle down here. It's actually quite in your face. The police will, walk straight to Aboriginal people in the streets and say, "Come on, you black bastards, move along. Get out of here, get up, get going." In some parts of the country, they just literally push them and keep pushing them to try and get a reaction so they can then be arrested. We have a massive problem with police deaths in custody or black deaths in custody through police interactions. At the moment of arrest, black people are being shot and killed and that all over the country. And this, until recently, there's only ever been 1 or 2 people who ever charged. And out of those charges, no one's ever been convicted. Not one person has ever stood trial to answer for their actions that's caused the death of Aboriginal people. And some of them are absolutely horrific. One in Western Australia recently where a woman was shot in the middle of the street. She was surrounded by police. Another cop pulled up, jumped out of his car, and within 5 seconds had started shooting. Yet all the other police who were closer and surrounding her hadn't seen any indication of threatening behaviour that would have caused her life to have been taken. He was acquitted.
That's shocking. I mean, is there a belief in Australia? I mean, obviously, it's not all Australians, so obviously, but some Australians, do they view the Aboriginal population as being particularly dangerous or violent? Because I struggle to see why you're so heavily incarcerated and why the police are so heavy-handed.
There's a bad misinterpretation of the alcoholism in the Aboriginal community, and it is a problem. And that caused a little bit of violence amongst other Aboriginal people, usually just amongst other people who are drunk. So there's a bit of a reputation there for being violent. But Aboriginal people as a whole, aren't violent at all. We never knew war in this country until colonisation. It just didn't happen. We had major trading routes throughout the country and life in this country was one of cooperation. And people had to work together to survive. One person can survive by themselves, but it's very, very hard. You need to have a small group of people and the larger the group of people, the better survival you have. The more foods and stuff you can actually collect and gather. And it got that way in most traditional Aboriginal societies. People only work 2 hours a day. And that was enough to supply them with all their needs for that day and what they needed for the following morning before they had to go out and start working again for 2 hours. Not 8, not 10, not all day. It was it was actually probably a better lifestyle than what we enjoy now. I mean, 2 hours, spend the rest of the day doing your arts and crafts and doing whatever you feel like playing with the kids. Kids were allowed to grow up until the ages of 12, and then they had to start learning to be an adult. Until then, they weren't disciplined. They run free, be kids.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people say that, in a balance, and they have this idea that when the sort of British came there and sort of colonised Australia and took it over and populated it, etc., that they brought with it all this advancement, and that people like yourself should be grateful for modern roads and electricity and air conditioning and etc., etc. I mean, that seems to be a very common trope that is thrown back at your community.
It's one of those things. It's like trying to value a fish on its ability to climb a tree. I mean, you mean by the wrong yardstick. The English idea of progress and everything, with farming on a large scale and so on, worked in England. It didn't work here because we have a different type of ecology and a different type of soil structure. The soil structure in Australia is actually very thin. It only goes down, in some places, a few feet. So the type of traditional farming that's been practiced here in Australia for the last 200 years really doesn't work. It destroys the land. And the advent of hooved animals, cattle, sheep, goats and pigs and stuff, literally impacted the land much further and made a lot of the wild grasses and foodstuffs impossible to grow because the land was too solidly packed and it had to be loosely packed. And as a result, a lot of the native foodstuffs have died out or are in very, very rapid decline now. A lot of them are also being refound and hopefully repropagated. But the advent of hooved animals did probably more damage to this country than anything else. White men coming in with guns did the major amount of damage. Within 2 days, the first settlement here in Australia, Aboriginal people were being killed, being shot, because they were encroaching upon land that had been claimed to be white land, but it wasn't. It was their land.
Yeah. I mean, do you think there's a feeling within Australia? I mean, you're talking about the reduction of animals and the farming techniques and the violence. Do you think the country as a whole has faced up to its legacy, is aware of it, or do you feel that day of reckoning is still to come?
It's still coming. Everything is being recognised slowly, but there's still a large section of the community that are saying, no, we can't recognise it. Most of that happens to be from the politicians and the people in power. The Mabo case, which was done by Eddie Mabo back in the late 80s, early 90s, the decision was handed down in 93 or 94, which said that Australia was a sovereign Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander country. The sovereignty had never been ceded, and therefore we still are the true owners of this country. That was handed down through the Australian High Court. The moment they made that decision, they had to stop there because they had no power through that decision, no power to go any further, because they literally don't have any right in this country to make laws. Yet we haven't gone any further with that court case. We haven't taken it to the High Court or the World Court to have it ratified or have another decision made on it under international law, which is something we probably have to have a look at, if only to force the government's hand into allowing us to have equal representation in Parliament so we can have an actual say in the running of this country. It is
in terms of that, I mean, sorry to cut in there, Rob, but I mean, in terms of that, I mean, sort of talking about the politicians, your prime ministers, your government ministers, has there been many Aboriginal people in these roles? Is there anyone we would know of? Because I think most of the politicians from Australia I'm thinking of, tend to be white. I'm struggling to think of an Aboriginal. I'm sure there are, but there's not one that I know of.
Actually, we have a couple of very, very good Aboriginal people in Parliament now, mostly in the Senate, and one or two in the House of Reps. In the Senate, we have Mullindiri McCarthy from the Northern Territory and Father Pat Dodson, or formerly Father Pat Dodson from the Northern Territory. Both very strong, both been involved in Aboriginal affairs for years. Pat Dodson was a member of the Central Lands Council for very many years. Mullindiri McCarthy was a journalist I worked with in Darwin back in the early 90s, and has been in the Northern Territory Parliament for many years as well, and has moved into federal Parliament now. Also, Linda Burnley from New South Wales is another absolutely fantastic Aboriginal advocate. She is brilliant. She's going to go a lot of places. Then there are others that are in politics who are less than safe. They might be Aboriginal, but they're not doing anything to advance Aboriginal causes. They're actually working on behalf of mining companies and places like that. So we don't really consider them any longer to be Aboriginal. They've become part of the white system.
And in terms of your leader, Scott Morrison, how is he viewed by the Aboriginal community?
Well, he's not our leader, for a start. The Aboriginal community, we have our own leaders, and each nation has their own leaders and stuff. Morrison is he's two-faced. He lies. He cannot tell the truth. He uses his religion as a crutch or as a tool to try and put a point across. And his religion is very much the dollar. It's got nothing to do with the Bible or anything like that. I have literally no time for him. In fact, if he was to try and shake my hand, well, it'd be a struggle, let's say. No, I have no time for him whatsoever. He's probably, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous people in Australia at the moment.
And in terms of your communities, because I think many of us may be aware of we'll see on TV sort of North America, the indigenous people over there, they have these reservations. I think they refer to them as. In Australia, is that a similar thing? Do you have reservations and plots of land that are yours, or how's the difference there?
Still reservations and missions here in Australia. The last one here in Tasmania closed down in 1954, I believe. My grandmother was actually born on there. That was on one of the islands up in Bass Strait. There are still missions around Australia. My former wife was born on one in North Queensland. I've lived on several myself, and there are some that are absolutely beautiful and that tourist developers would like to get their hands on, but because they're Aboriginal missions, they've said, no, you can't. This is our land. We're not giving it up now. It took us years to get this land back from the churches, which is our land in the first place. Now that we have got it back, we are keeping it as our own land. So a lot of these missions and former reserves are now owned by Aboriginal corporations and so on. But they're still known as the missions and reserves because it's basically what they were always known as. It's just that now they don't have to gain permission to leave the mission to go into a town or whatever. Whereas before they had to get written permission to actually leave the reserve to go to work or to go to the doctors or to even go to the shops. And if you didn't have that written permission, you couldn't go. If you went, you got arrested.
That's unbelievable. Unbelievable. What are they like today? I mean, in terms of amenities, in terms of social life, community, younger people, I mean, are they quite withdrawn, cut off society, or is it quite a nice place to live on these things, these areas?
On the community, yeah. Some of the communities are absolutely fantastic, beautiful places to go to. Tourists who happen to pass through, if they stop there, they're just overwhelmed by the sheer beauty and the friendliness of the people. Then there are other places like Wilcannia in Western New South Wales, which we spoke about last time. had a bad COVID outbreak last year, and Australia was shocked to find out the average age of the population out there is quite young, because people die. Men die at the age of 37, and women die at the age of 39. It's got one of the lowest life expectancies anywhere in the world, and this is in a modern country. This is only 4 hours drive from Sydney, and yet the population there, which are all Aboriginal, have been condemned to a life of less than 40 years because of living conditions and runoff from the mines and various other things, lack of health services, lack of any other type of fresh water, really, and fresh foods and so on. They're not allowed to go out and hunt traditionally, because the lands that they're surrounded by are owned by mining companies.
I mean, do you feel as though that no one's got your best interests at heart in power? I mean, I know you said that there are politicians, but do you feel almost a people that, without a seat at the table, without, you're shouting, but no one's listening, if I could use that metaphor?
Well, we can shout all we like, but the trouble is most of these boards and stuff that are tasked with looking after our welfare, supposedly, have got mining executives on them, fossil fuel company executives. And it's not in their interest to try and do anything for us, because they're after the minerals that's on the land underneath where we're living. So it's in their best interest for the communities to become unviable, to move those people on. Then they can have access to those minerals. So, it's genocide by stealth. They pretend to be doing things, say, okay, we'll put lots of money in it, then spend all that money on reports and feasibility studies and stuff, and getting experts in from overseas to tell us stuff that we already know. Yeah, we need fresh water. Don't talk about it, do it.
Yeah.
It's definitely genocide by stealth. The government's appearing to do the right thing, but at the same time doing very little.
And in terms of the mining, I mean, that's an interesting point there. I mean, obviously, you said a lot of the resources are on Aboriginal lands, and they would like to get access to that. Is it against your community's beliefs? Like, would you be happy for the land to be mined if it was on your terms, or are you not wanting it mined at all?
Depending on the community, each community is different. Some communities take to mining because they can see the benefit of the royalties and so on from the mining in improving their communities. And so for some of them, it's worked out very well. Other communities are totally against mining. I mean, the idea of mining to me is abhorrent. We have enough resources already. We can recycle the resources that we have here. And the rest of it, we don't really need to be mining for resources. We have carbon fibres now. We have man-made materials that we can produce that are just as strong as steels. So why do we have to keep mining for steel and iron ore, basically destroying the earth and destroying the water tables through mining? Fracking is one of the worst things out. It's destroying the water table. Before long, we're going to be pushing the proverbial uphill looking for fresh water in Australia, because most of our fresh water comes from underground. There's very little falls from the sky here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of Australia, I mean, to the global population, as a quick snapshot, is that the government there is quite pro mining. They're not very green. They seem to be very much into that. Is that the case on the ground there?
When you've got police forces driving around in vehicles that have got signage on them saying sponsored by Santos, I mean, that's a pretty fair indication the government has been bought. And you see it all over the place. Government vehicles sponsored by various mining companies and fossil fuel companies. I mean, if they're not saying that, look, we own this government, nothing is. It's blatant advertising. We bought you. So the mining companies have more power here in this country than anyone else. They tell the politicians what they want, and it happens.
For Aboriginal community, I mean, you seem almost stuck in between, because you've got the government who obviously, you say they're collaborating with the mining companies, but you're the sort of what's the phrase? something in the soup. Is it? What's the phrase I'm looking for? You know, the sort of you're sort of the cork in the bottle, shall we say? You know, everything would flow better if you would just disappear. And you're saying maybe that's what they're trying to do. You feel that's the plan.
That is their plan, I think. The assimilation policy of the 30s and the 40s didn't really work that well. So now they're thinking, okay, well, we just have to literally kill them off, allow them to die out, allow the problems that are in the communities and stuff now to just get worse and worse until such time as we have to move them off that area. And then we can go and move and say, no one lives here anymore, we can take your land. This government has been very deceitful with a lot of things. Earlier this week, they announced $1 billion to try and save the Great Barrier Reef. Now, that $1 billion is going to be spent on reports and this, that, and the other. There's going to be no money spent on actually doing anything to stop the damage to the reef. They might stop a bit of runoff and everything, but the runoff is only causing part of the problems. Most of it's coming from coral bleaching from the sun. And unless they can put up a huge, great UV cover, several thousand square kilometres of reef, nothing's going to happen. And that announcement, anyway, was only an announcement. It will never actually be spent.
Yeah.
They're very good at making it and never spending money.
Yeah. I mean, it seems such a desperate situation in some ways. I mean, you look at different sort of, things in the world where sort of lawyers take these cases on and they help people, but it seems like you're almost the people that have been forgotten about. You've sort of been left behind.
Very much so. And we've been telling people for years now that with climate change, you really have to stop and start listening to us, because if you don't, you're going to be in bad trouble. We've survived several ice ages already, the last 3 or 4 minimum, probably more. We have knowledge on how to actually do that and how to actually survive. And the way we live now, we cannot survive an ice age. We're too centralised. We need to spread out more. We need to have smaller plots of land that are only going to pretty much support a small amount of people. We can't afford to live in cities and so on if we want to survive a future ice age, because the amount of resources and heating is going to be needed just to warm that area and feed that area is just going to be, it's going to be impossible, because there's not enough land around there to do it. And there are other ways, different older technologies we can go back to help us, but we can't stop climate change. We can't stop the battery that is the world heating up and cooling down. It has done for, in a cycle for millions and millions of years. Climate change is inevitable. We could possibly slow it down and delay it a little bit, but we're already 8,000 years overdue for this ice age. It's already 8,000 years overdue. So, it's going to happen. It's going to happen soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one thing I want to ask you, it's a two-part question. Number one, do you think of yourself as an Australian? And the part two of that, is it fair to say that Australia is a racist country?
No, I don't think of myself as an Australian. I've been Aboriginal all my life. As I was growing up, I was always called a little black bastard or something like that. I was never called a little half Australian bastard or half black bastard. I was always a little black bastard. Then when I started standing up for myself and saying, yes, I am proudly black. It was, you're not really black, are you? It's only a part of your tiny little part. So, no, I'm not Australian. I am Aboriginal. And why would I devalue myself from coming from the world's oldest culture that survived here for over 80,000 years to being Australian that's been here for, 234 years or something? Now, that's a huge devaluation that I'm not prepared to take. I mean, I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of coming from a culture that has lived in one of the harshest environments in the world for the last 80,000 years and done so spectacularly. Have done some massive works of arts and petroglyphs and stone carvings and paintings that are just valued all around the world. I mean, why wouldn't I be proud of being Aboriginal? Why would I want to be Australian?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, is Australia a racist country, would you say, as well? And the second part of that?
Yes, very much so. and not just towards Aboriginal people, but towards anyone who's not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. If you're from an Asian country, you're hated. If you're from Eastern European country, you're hated. If you're Greek, you're hated. The Australian community tends to be very insular. You'll find there'll be pockets of Greeks and Serbians and Chinese, Japanese, that living in small areas. And you'll think, geez, there seems to be a lot of Japanese people around here. And you realise, well, no, there's actually a lot of Japanese people living in a very small concentrated area because they feel safer in numbers because of the actual racism they encounter every day as well. It's quite funny, actually, in that Aboriginal people probably have a better relationship with the minorities and refugee communities that have moved here to Australia in the past 20 or 30 years than what we do with people that were born here and grew up here.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we don't want to make this all doom and gloom because, like you say, I mean, you're one of the oldest cultures that, in the world and still going strong and still thriving. So, maybe tell me what it's like now for maybe, the younger generation, the sort of people that are, 10, 12, 13 years old, the outlook for them in Australia. Do you feel as though they can be proud of the Aboriginal? Do you think the culture will stay on? Do you think things are a better place they were than you were when you were that age?
I think it's getting a lot better. I think our children are not being held back as much as we were as kids with learning. I mean, I went through a school system where I was taught I didn't even exist. Aboriginal people in Tasmania were wiped out, and the last one died out in 1876. But I didn't exist, and I'd stand up in class and say something, get thrown out. Then my grandmother would have to go down there the following day and tear shreds off them, which generally fixed things out because no one argued with them. The situation now is a lot better. Yeah, my nieces and my nephews are learning things at school that I had to learn at home. And of course, they're learning at school. Other kids are learning it too, which means that knowledge is now being shared around. Kids are having cultural camps. My nephew last year went on a cultural camp. Just a whole heap of boys from his school went on one camp, a whole heap of girls went on another camp with Aboriginal elders, and they went out into the bush and learnt bushcraft, learned how to make spears properly, how to straighten the wood, and how to get kinks out of the wood, and then fire hardening and so on. Learned about food production and where to find food if you're stuck in the bush, how to find water, how to find out if the water is actually good enough to drink. Is it polluted or not? Those sorts of things. So, yeah, the kids nowadays growing up in the Aboriginal community, it's a lot better for them. A lot better for them. We've made so many advances, even in the last 30 or 40 years, let alone in the last 100 years. The calls to Invasion Day or Australia Day to change started in the 1930s. People think it's only a relatively new thing, but it's not. It's just becoming more and more widespread as more of the community and the white community take it up here in Australia in latter years. So that will change. There will be an inclusive Australia Day, maybe a national day at some stage in the future. I don't know whether I'll see it because that probably will be 10, 20 years away. I doubt very much whether I'll live that long. That's another part of being Aboriginal. I'll be 58 in 2 weeks, yet my life expectancy is another 6 to 8 years. So a lot of people don't realise that these are things we have to accept and face up to here in this country as an Aboriginal person.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of, looking at you as I'm right now, and we're talking, you actually saying that, it's like almost sends a shiver down the spine for you to say that your life expectancy is 6 years away. And I'm based in the UK, and I don't know, I think my life expectancy is like 74, 75. So I'm at least another 10, 12 years on top of you, which is for what reason?
Yeah, well, we don't know. It's just health conditions, living conditions, the way we grew up. Our kids will probably live longer than us because they had better conditions growing up. But for the older generations, my generation, we're still looking at an average lifespan of maybe 64 to 66. And like I said, that's 6 years away from it. 6 to 8 years. And that's something you have to prepare for and you have to expect. Because there's no point making plans for 20 years' time if you're not going to be here. There's no point. You just got to live every day as it comes. Enjoy it now as it happens. Give up that hating and so on, and just accept things as they are. Try to change them, but you don't change things through hate.
Yeah, because I mean that's something. I mean, we're speaking a while now. I mean that's one thing that I do find quite surprising is that you are quite calm about this. You don't seem to have any bitterness, and I can only imagine what it's like to be in your situation. As you can see, I'm a white male, and I've had all the advantages that come with that. So I've never had these problems. But I'm surprised that you're so calm, understanding. There's no bitterness, which I would expect.
There is bitterness there. I don't let it out because hate only begets more hate. And I know what the effect of hate is. I've been hated most of my life just for who I am, not for anything I've done, just basically for existing. And I've been put down, been told I'm less than worthless because I'm black. And that sort of thing hurts. And to hurt somebody else back as a reprisal just doesn't seem to be the right thing to do. I mean, you can get your point across without hurting people. And you can make your points without hurting people. And hate just begets more hate. And there's enough hate in this world already without me adding to it. So why bother?
Yeah, sure. But before we finish, Rob, there's one thing I want to ask about was the Aboriginal art, because that's something that's quite a big part of your culture. People doing art, and I think maybe not so lot known about it. Could you maybe give us a flavour of what the art represents? What sort of what sort of motivations they are, and how does the art take form? Because it's obviously different from maybe the sort of Western style art.
Well, art takes many forms, and it changes throughout Australia. Down here in Tasmania, our major form of art was petroglyphs, so carving symbols into rock. Now, you're looking at work of months, sometimes years, to actually carve some of these symbols. Some of them worked as calendars, so from sitting in a certain place, you'd be able to see where the sun rose at certain times of the year and the solstices and things like that. Others were meant for different reasons. We're not really quite sure what, because that type of art form existed 20,000 years ago and hasn't been practiced since. Different forms of art took over after that, hand stencils and so on, which are also prevalent at the same time. But most of the art here in Tasmania has literally either been destroyed or just doesn't exist anymore because it was done on things like barks and stuff like that, which break down over the years. On the mainland, art is much different. It's been done in rock galleries and there are different styles of art. You've got dot paintings and from around the Central Australia and X-ray paintings from further north. And some of the artworks are absolutely fantastic. One of my twins is an artist, and she's based in Melbourne. She teaches actually in the Victorian prison systems, goes around teaching Aboriginal prisoners arts and that. So they've got something to fall back on when they get out, just different techniques. And some of her work is absolutely fantastic, which really annoys me because I used to paint over all of her walls when she was a kid and used crayons out. I could have made a fortune. But art is one of those things that is very prevalent in the Aboriginal community because Aboriginal community or Aboriginal people are very artistic. I mean, we only work 2 hours a day, usually in a traditional lifestyle. It gave us a lot of time to sit around painting and developing different crafts and different technologies. Technologies like leaven bread. We had leaven bread here some 8,000 years before the Egyptians. Yet Egyptians are still recognised as being the inventors of leaven bread. And again, that's comes from the education system here, trying to keep Aboriginal people down. We were always considered to be nomadic wanderers, and you had a nomadic lifestyle. And it's been proven in latter years that no, that isn't quite the case. Yeah, there were seasonal moves. That was only for seasonal food soon, but it was always coming back to the same place where there were crops that were growing at, propagated, and were assisting to grow through plastic farm. So it was very much an agricultural type of lifestyle, not the nomadic hunter-gatherer. But this is evidence that's still coming out and still slowly being accepted by the rest of the community.
Yeah, it's amazing how much stuff is, as you say, it's still been discovered and still being found now. In terms of language, obviously we're speaking English here, but I'm sure your ancestors, well, of course they did speak English. In terms of language, has that continued now? Will you speak in a more traditional language with your family, or is that sort of thing no longer practiced?
A lot of Australian language is still very important, still spoken daily. There's well over 100 languages still in use daily throughout Australia, and possibly over 200 languages that are still being spoken. Here in Tasmania, our language pretty much was never recorded properly, and was basically lost. But in recent years, the last 20 years, there's been a push towards a reconstruction of the language, what was recorded in official accounts and what has been remembered by various members of the community. And different sayings and different words that have now been incorporated back into the language of Palawa, which is basically just a reconstructed Aboriginal language from Tasmania. So it's borrowing from 3 or 4 different languages and combining them all together, basically under the one umbrella. But in other parts of Australia, language is still very important and hasn't had to be reconstructed in any way. My daughters speak Kukuyalanji, which is the language of their mother's tribal group. I speak it a little bit too. I also speak a bit of Birugaba, a bit of Pitjantjatjara and Creole. And that's basically all been through work. I've had to learn through work and through people I've been working with in various parts of Australia. But yes, language is very important to us. And travel throughout Australia, and language tends to be very much the same, especially when we speak in Creole, which is like an Aboriginal English. I can go to Darwin and speak Creole to an Aboriginal person up there, and they'll understand me perfectly. Yet, if they were speaking in Yolngu or one of the other languages up there, I'd be really battling out to try and keep up.
Yeah. I mean, it's great to hear that. I mean, it's great to hear the language. And again, I had no appreciation that these languages are still spoken. So, no, it's been really great talking to you today, Rob. And I hope people out there have listened and understood. And we've got an insight into. It's a bad life for the Aboriginal people, but it's improving, and it's not all doom and gloom. You're a strong culture. You've got a lot going on, and you're not going anywhere. And I think that's the most important thing to think about. That this is not a story of it's all over. It's a story of maybe things are not going as well as they could, but they're starting to improve. And you're still there as a culture. You're still there as a people. You're not going anywhere.
We're definitely not going anywhere. This is our country, and we can't go anywhere. Where else can we go? We've had protests and had people saying, go back to where you come from. Where? We are here. So, you got to look at things with a bit of a sense of humour as well. And if it's all doom and gloom, well, we've already got bad suicide rates, hugely bad suicide rates in the Aboriginal community. And if we were to dwell on everything that was going bad in the Aboriginal community, none of us would be here. We would all have cut our throats years ago. So, we're definitely not going anywhere. We're here for the long run. And, as much as they try to get rid of us, we're stronger than that. They've tried here with my mob here in Tasmania. They've invented a word, genocide, to try and cover us. But we're still here. We're not going nowhere. And besides, I will be winning views like this.
Oh, amazing. What we're looking at there, Rob, as we finish, what water are we looking at there? Can you tell us what that is?
That's part of the Derwent River. That's part of the Derwent River that runs through Hobart. We're up in the upper reaches here. We're actually only about 800 metres from the Cadbury chocolate factory right now, about 200 from my group. And this is just part of Hobart, northern suburbs. Hobart's the capital city of Tasmania, and it's a pretty nice place.
So, well,
see why I like living here.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Fishing is just outside me.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for speaking to me today. Hopefully everyone's enjoyed it. They've learned a bit about it, and you're on Twitter. So if anyone's listening and they want to ask more questions, I know you're happy to take questions and talk about your culture and explain things to people who maybe they're scared to ask, but they can come and ask you, and you're an elder of the community and you're happy to talk to them.
By all means, I also work, so I can't always answer questions immediately, but I will get to them some stage throughout the day, and love answering questions. So part of what I do is to educate people, and you do that by answering questions. And there's no such thing as a stupid question, only stupid answers.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again, Rob, for your time. I do appreciate you joining me. Thank you very much.
No problem, Chris.